Defence and security experts from Australia and the United States are holding a two-day workshop in Canberra to explore much closer cooperation between the countries. Also on the agenda are China's growing influence in the region and the effects of the recent cuts to Australia's defence budget.
One of the visiting delegates is Dr. Patrick Cronin, a senior advisor and director of the Asia Pacific program at the Centre for a New American Security. He joins us now from Canberra. Patrick Cronin, thanks for your time this morning. Now, US Marines, we know they've already been in Darwin. There's another deployment due there next year. How much more cooperation do you see between Australia and the US in defence terms in the future?
I think there's going to be a steady increase in cooperation between the United States and Australia. There has been a great history of cooperation. Both countries are focused on how do they engage in the opportunities of a rising Indo-Pacific region, and how do they also manage the challenges.
Now, Michael O'Hanlon from Brookings, he's also been at this conference that you've been attending, and he says that Australia needs to increase, not cut, as the government has announced, defence spending. He says an increase by 50%. Do you agree that that's what Australia needs to do?
Well, it's up for the Australians to decide exactly what their defence budget is. They have to weigh it against all other concerns. But I can tell you, as an ally of Australia, the United States is hoping very much that its key allies, including Australia, are more actively engaged in this region in terms of defence. Defence is the highest and first priority and responsibility of a government. So yes, we would in general like to see more defence spending from Australia, yes.
Well, because the Defence Minister Stephen Smith has cited US budget defence cuts in support of the Australian position in lowering its defence spending.
Well, that may change very shortly in terms of the US election. We'll have to wait another 8 days. But I think Governor Romney, for instance, has been focused on the need to build up the maritime and air capabilities, including for the Pacific. And President Obama has made it very clear he has no intention to see cuts come to our assets in the Asia-Pacific region. So even though overall defense spending is constrained, we're going to be doing more in the Asia-Pacific.
What would you like to see Australia spend as a portion of GDP on defence?
I really don't think there's an easy metric on that. I do think that there's several problems. One of them is how much and how effectively can we spend dollars on acquisition of new platforms. Both of us are spending too much per platform. So reform is needed, but also we still have to spend money to acquire the platforms. And I'm thinking about the next generation of submarine, for instance, for Australia. That's an expensive investment, but it's necessary for the long-term security for Australia, and I think for the health of the whole region.
Now, what about US-China relations? The head of the ADF, General David Hurley, says his major concern is the relationship between the US military and China. Are tensions on this front likely to come to a head?
Well, I think this is a long-term question of how does the United States manage a rising China. And liberal democracies like Australia and the United States and other countries in the region have a great interest in encouraging the rise of the middle class of China, just as we've encouraged it in past decades. Will this lead to greater rivalry and potential conflict? It may lead to greater competition, sometimes rivalry, but I don't think it will lead to conflict. We have a lot of intermediate problems to deal with in this region, from humanitarian assistance and disaster response missions to the peninsula, Korean peninsula, where frankly the North Korean issue is the most explosive issue. And then we're managing these low-level conflicts and tensions in the East and South China Seas, which I don't think will erupt into war, but which require constant management on the part of allies like US and Australia.
Because we know that Barack Obama has already said that this is the Asia-Pacific is the region where he sees the military might of the US being focused on in the future. So that obviously has upset China to some extent. How is the US going about trying to placate those tensions?
Well, it's interesting to separate the rhetoric of the Obama administration from the reality. The reality is the United States never left the Asia-Pacific region. What the Obama administration has done relatively well is diplomatic engagement in the region, adopting sort of the ASEAN centrality approach of going to the East Asia Summit, going to the ASEAN Defense Ministers meetings, plus talking at the ASEAN regional forums. But militarily, most of the actions, like the Darwin deployment, or rotational forces through Darwin, and this is relatively modest in terms of the military scheme of things with U.S. and China, and we're far away from China here in Australia. So I wouldn't exaggerate the focus on greater military forces. We're trying to hold what is already a favorable position in this region so we can continue to work with all the countries in the region, including China, on a rules-based system that we can all get along with in the long term.
Patrick Cronin, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.